Um, Today I want to continue my topic about Hassidic insights on Purim. I think I will continue one more time with the Sfat Emet. That's the Rebbe of Gur. He was actually officially the third Rebbe of Gur, as I mentioned. His father passed away when he was 8 years old, and he grew up with his grandfather. That's Yehuda Aryeh Leib of Gur. Grandfather, his name was Rothenberg. We also, of course, have to remember we are going through a difficult period, not just for the Jewish people, but for the whole world. And therefore, we extend our prayers and our hopes that this pandemic, this magefa, be over as soon as possible. And as King David said in the Psalms, the psalm that we recite, where we request rifwa, which is a speedy recover for all those who are in the hospital. Lamanatzeach mizmor David ya'ancha Adonai b'yom tzara. Yisagev Hashem Elohei Yaakov. Yishlach ezracha mikodesh u'mitzion yis'adeka yizkorkom minchotecha. Ve'olatcha yidashne sela yiten lecha chilvavecha v'chol atzatcha yemalei. Neranena b'shuatecha. V'shem Eloheinu nidgol yemalei Adonai kol mishalotecha. Ata yadati kyoshi Adonai mishicho. יענהו משמי קדשו בגבורות ישע מינו אלה ברכב ואלה בסוסים. אנחנו בשם אדוני אלוהינו נזכיר המה קרעו ונפלה ואנחנו קמנו ונתעודד. אדוני יושיע מלך יעננו ביום קראנו. Okay, dear friends, I am reading from Sfat Emet on Pesach, which for those who have the book, it's actually quite classic, this copy, and you can find it in Vayikra, comes right after Parshat Tzav, which is coming up this week, Tzav and Shabbat HaGadol, and then he talks about Pesach. And I thought, hello Anna, hello Melody, hello Heather, hello Rabbi Constantine, hello Madeline, hello everybody, and thank you for joining. Okay, the first one I want to read is an insight of why we call the Seder the Seder. Okay. Now, I mean, there's always the obvious answer, Seder Pesach, because there's a lot to organize. It takes a long time, and this year it's going to be a little bit confusing, but normally it takes a long time to put that Seder together. Aside from cleaning the house, you also have to prepare the various things for the Seder in advance. Some people do it the easy way, going to hotels and catering, which is a little harder this year. I think catering we can still do theoretically for Pesach, because I heard that the virus actually does not attach itself to foods. So, basically, only to covers of foods. But basically, it's going to be a slightly different year this year. Maybe I'll open up and say something. There was the chief rabbi of Montreal of yesteryear, Rabbi Pinchas Hirschsprung, who was a Boger. He had studied Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin between the wars, the yeshiva, the famous yeshiva in Lublin by Rabbi Shapiro, the founder of the Daf Yomi, which actually closed down in 1933 with the Nazi occupation. Actually, this is a pre-Nazi years, but yeshiva was closed down already, I think 33 or 35. So basically, Rabbi Hirschsprung used to say, why is it that we call, when Jews greet each other and they say, how are you doing? So especially in Israel, we answer, Hakol B'Seder. Hakol B'Seder, meaning everything's okay, everything's in order. So he said, because that's life, he says. When we say Hakol B'Seder, it's like the Passover Seder. Even if there's a little bit of maror, a little bit of bitter herbs, that's also okay. Because life is not a rose garden. We expect a little bit of bitter herbs. If there's too much, that's something else. But a little bit we expect. So we say Hakol B'Seder. So without further ado, I'd like to go into the Sfat Emet and see how he understands this. Very often he quotes his grandfather, the Chidushei Harim, the founder of the Chassidut Gur. Shamati mipi mori zikeni. Mori zikeni, I told you, my teacher, my elder. Again, the term Saba or Sav did not exist in those days. I mean, maybe existed, but they never used it. Whenever they referred to their grandparents, it was also always Avi Zikeni, my grandfather. Avi Zikeni, that's the way they said it. Shamati mipi mori zikeni. Pesach Seder. Why is it that first night of Pesach, we refer to it as the Seder? And again, he's going to quote the Maharal of Prague. If you remember last week, he also quoted the Maharal. In general, I think the Hasidic world, as even the Mitnagdim later on, become very taken by the Maharal. I would say even till this day, the Maharal made a major comeback in the 20th century, especially among the Haredi world. And of course, also the Dati Lumi world. Anyhow, so he said, the Maharal says, "Sheyesh seder miyuchad al hanisim v'niflaot sheinam mikre." Says the Maharal says that miracles also have their own order. In other words, there's an order to the disorder, because theoretically, miracles seem to be something that are out of the event of nature, outside the order of nature. And therefore, as Einstein would say, that he doesn't believe that God plays with dice. And theoretically, miracles for rationalists are a problem. For Rambam, for instance, why would God do a miracle? If God knows what's going to happen in the future, and God is able to organize the world so well, why does he have to break the rules every now and then? Human beings have to sometimes break the rules because they didn't make the rules right. But divine rules shouldn't have to be broken. And if God made Chukei HaTeva, the natural laws, and it says in the Psalms, Gvul Samta Bal Yavorun, you have set down these boundaries and you do not have to exceed them, just like the oceans don't have to take over the land again. So why would God need miracles? Because of that, young Rambam, Maimonides, in his introduction, in his commentary on the Mishnah, in his basically his commentary on the Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers of the Mishnah, he claims that the statement of the Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, 10 things were created in the twilight between the sixth day and the Shabbat, and those 10 things seem to include miracles. So even though it actually doesn't say 10 miracles, but 10 things, Maimonides assumes that this is, or wants to assume that this is a rabbinic understanding, or less the way he understands it, that all miracles were created at the last minute between the sixth day and Shabbat. In other words, all the aberrations, all the exceptions to the rules of nature were already ingrained within nature at the last minute before Shabbat. This, of course, for rationalists is a good way to organize something which seems very disorganized. But for Maimonides, if God can see the future, so he can see already that the Jews will be in Egypt and that Pharaoh will run after them when they go to the Red Sea, and then God will need to split the Red Sea. So he can decide upon this well before, between that sixth and seventh day, between the sixth day and the Shabbat. Or when Korach is going to lead a rebellion against Moses, and it will be necessary to open up the earth to swallow up Korach and his assembly, that's something God can see in advance. So for Rambam, these are all exceptions to the rule which created before the natural laws were, you might say, got into effect. However, from the Maharal, the perception is very different. Of course, for rationalists, this is important because, again, why would God need to break the rules? For the Maharal, Rabbi Lev Yehuda ben Betzalel of Prague of the 16th century, all miracles have their own laws. The fact that they're not working according to the natural order of this world, as he writes in Gevurot Hashem, but they all have their own internal laws. They have their own internal reasoning of why they need to be the way they need to be. And that's what he is quoting here. Maybe I just want to add to that. That's a little bit different than Maimonides, by the way. He's actually not against the idea that God sometimes lets this higher order interact with the lower order. He doesn't argue that God had to know this at the beginning of creation, but it's basically a higher order of things interacting with a lower order at different times and different necessities. I want to mention one other thing about miracles. Remember, from a human standpoint, a miracle is something which is very subjective. I mean, the very fact that I can talk to you over a video through the Facebook, through the internet, through a computer, is something that 100 years ago would be considered a miracle. So technological advances can, with technological advances, we are confronting, we're experiencing, we are interfacing with things that our ancestors would consider a miracle. So sometimes the question is, are things that we consider a miracle just things that we have not yet understood? Now, I am going to be humble about this and argue that yes, there could be things that we cannot understand because at the end of the day, human perception is limited and human knowledge therefore is limited based on human ability and perception. Even if you put the minds together, as we know, they're just like there are colors which we cannot see because our eye can't see infrared and ultraviolet, and there are sounds we cannot perceive for the simple reason that our ears are made a certain way, but the elephants can hear lower sounds than us, and dogs can hear higher sounds than us. So we know that we have certain limitations. But in theory then, could it be that every miracle is just something within nature, or maybe deep within nature, which is built on laws that we just have not perceived yet? That's why I'm always wonder if maybe miracles are subjective to our understanding at this point. Okay, I will now go back to Sfat Emet. I just wanted to mention that. So he mentions the Maharal, and the Maharal therefore claims that miracles have their own order. It's just like, if you might say, a higher order versus a lower order. And I will continue. And therefore I can interpret according to this. It says about in the redemption to come, Isaiah says, you're not going to go out of the galut, out of the exile quickly, meaning it won't be like in Egypt. In Egypt, we left b'chipazon, in haste, and therefore we eat the matzah because the matzah didn't have time to leaven because we had to leave in haste. Ki b'chipazon yatzata me'eretz Mitzrayim, and therefore we had to make the matzot ugot matzot. We had to make them kilo chametz. We couldn't make them leaven because there was no time. Ki b'yetziat Mitzrayim, because when we left Egypt, hagula bimhirut, the redemption had to be quickly, he says. And it didn't have to be quickly because theoretically, why did it have to be quickly? If God can bring 10 plagues on Pharaoh, we can't go slowly. He can't hold back the Egyptian army. Is that too difficult for God to do? He says, no, we had to leave quickly. Shelo hayinu re'uyim. We were not really, we didn't have the merit to leave Egypt. So God had to do it quickly, in the sense that if you don't merit something, you do it without anybody looking. That has to be explained also. What does that mean? You know, it says about Noah. The Zohar says about Noah. Why did Noah have to go into an ark? God could have brought the deluge, the Mabul, all over the globe, but left a certain piece where Noah and the animals would stay. There's even a point of view in the Zohar that the flood didn't happen over the land of Israel. But putting that aside, theoretically, Noah could have been in a place. God could have designated the flood is not in that place. If you want a high mountain like Ararat, where eventually the ark is going to rest, and that's where he has the animals. Why does he have to be in an ark? The Zohar says when there is tragedy and death, and the angel of death is given permission to go out and bring disease and death, when God wants to save somebody, they have to be covered. For that reason, when the angel of death went in Egypt on the last plague of Makat Bechorot, the plague of the firstborn, all the Israelites had to be in their house. They had to put the blood on the doorpost so that the angel of death would pass over their house. That's why we call it Passover, Pesach. Pasach al batei avotenu b'Mitzrayim, God passed over, meaning the angel of death in this case, passed over our houses and smote the firstborn of the Egyptians. As Rabbi Constantine has mentioned the famous verse, which says in Yoel, Lech ami bo b'chadarecha ad ya'avor za'am. Oh, my people, go into your rooms until the time stops. So in a sense, even though we're going into this concealed rooms in confinement and lockdown because we don't want the disease to interact with us, there's also spiritual reasons to do so, in a sense that we're not always sure that our merit is enough to single us out. And just like Noah had to go into the Teva, it's something to think about during these unusual times. So he says, Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus story, had to be quickly because the Jewish people didn't really have enough merit. As I said, there's a famous Midrash, a Midrash Rabbah, where the angels at Yam Suf, at the Red Sea, say to God, why are you killing the Egyptians by drowning them and letting the Jews go? Halalu ovdei avodah zarah, halalu ovdei avodah zarah. Both of these are real idol worshippers, because the Jews, according to the Midrash, fell already to the 49th level of impurity. That's a concept, meaning they were so immersed within the culture of Egypt, they had barely remembered who they were. All they remembered, as according to the Midrash, was their names and their clothing, which has to be explained what it means to remember your name and your clothing. So it says, in Egypt we left quickly. We didn't have the merit. It had to be in haste. We did not have the merit. But now על-ידי סיפור יציאת מצרים בכל שנה ובכל יום, הטעמים של יציאת מצרים, כמו שכתב רש"י בעבור זה הוציאנו, כדי לקיים מצוותיו, וכפי מה שמקיימים ומשבחים מהללים לפניו, נמצא נעשה מסודר ומיושב טעמי הגאולה, וכשיהיה מתיישב הכל, יהיה הגאולה עתידה. It says, because we were saved because of God's love for our ancestors, Ki le'olam chasdo, as we say, there's one of the Psalms which is called the Psalm Hallel Mitzrayim, which means the praise of the Jews for going from Egypt. And 36 times it says Ki le'olam chasdo, that God took us out because of loving kindness. So he says, but every year, when we tell the story of the Exodus, and we look for reasons what happened in Yetziat Mitzrayim, as Rashi says, this is the reason why God took us out, to keep his commandments, and according to what we can praise and God on that night, and try to understand the meaning of this redemption. This will bring the final redemption. Because God took us out of Egypt because he knew clearly, because he knew the potential of the Jewish people. Even though we didn't have the merit, he knew that these people are going to be the ones who will find this merit, to worship him in truth. So, what he's really saying is like this. Every year, when we sit at that Seder, and we talk about the Exodus story, and we try to understand why God took us out, the more we understand why he took us out, and what the point was, and the more that we can actualize these aspects and elements within our lives as individuals, as families, communities, and as a nation, this justifies retroactively taking us out of Egypt. So if God took us out of Egypt because we did not have zechut, merit, but every year as our merit accumulates, every year it justifies more and more this exodus. And therefore, Kimei Tzitcha, The Navi says, as just like the days that I took you out of Egypt, I shall show you wonders. The wonders that will happen in the final redemption are based on our building up enough merit for it to come. That's also a discussion too, because the Talmud says, and it seems to be the dominant view, that God will bring the final redemption even without merit. However, even without merit has merit. That has to be something which is explained, but let me just say in the name of Maimonides writes in his Hilchot Tshuva, Muftachim anu sheYisrael atidim asot tshuva. We have a promise that the Jewish people eventually will do the right thing. What does it mean we have a promise? What is the assurance? There's something about the drama of which the Jewish people goes through, that when you understand this drama, then you understand that the merit, the collective merit that the Jewish people gets by going through this drama justifies many things that happens to them. I'll leave it at that. But so it says basically, we didn't have merit when we left Egypt, but every year when we try to understand more and more the Egypt story, this creates merit, this advances us, and therefore we merit to come closer and closer to the final Geulah. As it says, I took you out of Egypt to be your God, because, he explains, I took you out of Egypt because I knew that you had that ability. I've always said, if God asked the Jewish people to believe in him, her, it means that God believes that the Jewish people have the potential of belief. Because belief is not just belief that. Belief that is a rational hypothesis. Belief is belief in. It's a relationship. And God knew that the Jewish people had the possibility of this, creating this relationship with God while they're all still in the natural world. And so this is a potential. The word emunah in Hebrew is like the same root as the word omanut. It's an art. And like every art form, you have to develop it. Even if you're a good musician, you have to develop your ability to sing, to produce music, whatever you do. It's an art form, and art form has to be worked upon, just like emunah. So, as it says, that was the goal, for me to be your God. This happens little by little and fully realize itself in the futuristic time. And this is really all the questions of Pesach, they're all pointing in that direction. They're pushing us to realize what we have achieved as individuals and as a people, and how much closer are we to our goal. This is what's hinted out in the four boys, the four sons. Remember, there are both four questions at the beginning. The four happens a lot. You have 4 cups of wine, 4 expressions of redemption, Leshonot Shegula. Then you have the 4 sons, and of course the Manishtana, the Firkasha, is the 4 questions at the beginning. So what is the Daled Banim, the 4 sons? The 4 sons represent 4 types of Jews. Of course, we've heard this before. You know, the 4 types of sons represents 4 types of Jews in the United States in 4 generations. I'm sure some of you have heard that before. But I want to keep to him for a moment. He says the 4 sons represents 4 questions or skepticisms that the Jewish people have about their role in the world. He actually doesn't tell us what it is here. He does that every now and then. He makes a statement, which is like a very big statement, okay? And he doesn't tell us what it is, or sometimes he'll do it fragmented, and then he expects us to figure the rest. I'm not sure why he does that, but it's interesting that he does that. But I'm willing to speculate, but let's go back to this for a moment. So it says the 4 sons represent 4 types of sfekot, 4 types of doubts or skepticisms, sheish blibot, that Jewish people have in different ways. Kach yesh galut Mitzrayim, because look, there are also 4 exiles. There's the exile of Egypt. Just like you have the exile from Egypt, and the exile, in his understanding, represents doubts. In every year, the redemption is aroused, and these questions or doubts have to be clarified. And everything has to be arranged perfectly, to be understood clearly. It must be understood clearly. And then we won't have to run out of Egypt, because it'll make sense to us. And because of these four types of queries or doubts, that's the four exiles. Each one of the exiles is in order to clarify something within the national psyche of the Jewish people. And that's why we have four expressions of redemption, as we said in another place. And therefore it says, God says to Abraham about his children, that they're going to be slaves in a land which is not theirs, and it will be for 400 years. It says, Vavadum v'inotam, they will be slaves and inflicted 400 years, which Rashi calculates happened 400 years after the birth of Isaac. Why 400 years? 400 represents four levels. You have digits from 1 to 10. This is, by the way, an idea that is found in a lot of Kabbalistic writings. Digits from 1 to 10. Then you have from 10 to 100. Then you have 100 to 400. If you remember, I'm talking about, and then you have thousands. Now, this could be understood in two ways. In the Hebrew alphabet goes as far as 400, because Aleph to Yud is 1 to 10. Then Yud to Kuf already skips 10, 20, all the way to 100. Then you have, right, the tens. And then Kuf to Taf is from 100 to 400. So basically, when you do the gematria, or the numerical value of letters in the Hebrew letters, it goes digits, tens, hundreds. Now, very often what they do is after Taf, because why stop at 400, they add the last letters, which we call the letters mansapach. You know, in the Hebrew language, there are final letters, mem sofit, nun sofit, tzadi sofit, pei sofit, and kaf sofit. These are letters, another 6 letters, which have doubles, meaning at the end of the word, they're written differently. And so those who add the letters mansapach to the end of the alphabet, and then instead of 400 becomes 500, 600, 700, 800, 900, meaning they're 5 of mansapach, goes up to 900, and then it goes back to the aleph, and aleph also means aleph, which is 1,000. So when you look at the letters of the Hebrew language and you add to it those 5 letters, end letters called mansapach, it actually goes up to 900, and then the cycle starts again from the aleph, which is also aleph, which is 1,000. That's one way of understanding what he's saying here, that when you talk about 400, there are different cheshbonot, because officially 400 is the end of the alphabet, right? Which is tough. That's what it means, 400 years. Because there are yechidot, there are digits, asiriyot, tens, me'ot, hundreds, and alafim, which is thousands. Das chozel achdut, and then it goes back to the 1, because it goes from 1,000 back to the aleph, which is 1. But until the hundreds, meaning before you hit that 1,000, there's still things that have to be clarified. That's called the 400 years in Egypt, meaning there are levels. It's 4 levels. Digits, tens, hundreds, but once you hit the thousands, it brings you already, things are clarified, it brings you back to the aleph. So the 4 galuyot, therefore, represent this idea. By the way, there's another idea which mentioned another place, and mentioned by the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad in his halachot, when Rivka is taken by the servant of Abraham, Eved Avraham, and finally they let her go, and she said, do you want to follow this man? And she says, yeah, I'm going. And then they say, Achotenu at hayi alfei revava. Our sister, we wish you that you will be plentiful, meaning your seed will be plentiful, like thousands and myriads. Alfei revava. So the Ben Ish Chai says, what does that mean? He says, because you have the 4 letters of the name of God, which represent 4 worlds. And the 4 worlds are also represented by digits, tens, hundreds, and thousands. But when you say to somebody, I want you to be in the thousands, that's already the highest level. When you say myriads, tens of thousands, it means already the supernatural level. In other words, they're actually blessing Rivka that her seed go beyond the natural level to the rivava, which comes from the word ribui, multiplication, and goes beyond the aspirations of the natural world. So getting back to this is a typical Sfat Emet, in a sense. He's right throwing out a bombshell, but he's really not clarifying it completely. Now he mentioned something like this in another place. That's true. You have to start looking around here and there sometimes to see. And sometimes you wonder, what is the reason he is not clarifying it to the end? Sometimes he doesn't clarify it to the end, maybe because he's not sure if he wants to. Remember, these are Dvar Torahs that he gave in his congregation on Shabbat, and he himself writes it down when Shabbat's over at some point. Another possibility is that, I would say in general, people who are very intuitive, especially in Torah study, they start feeling ideas. And before the idea crystallizes in their mind, they feel a certainty there's something going on here. And even before they clarify to themselves the ideas, they might spell it out. That could also be what's going on here. That he feels that there's idea here, it makes a lot of sense, and he has to think about it more. 2 possibilities. In other words, either he has, but he's not telling us here, or he has to think about it more. So let's try to speculate what we think is going on here. First of all, let me just rehash some of the ideas here. He started off by asking the question, why is the Passover Seder called a Seder? And then he mentioned that miracles have their own order, their own internal order, even though they seem to be an aberration of the laws of nature. Then he goes on to say that when we left Egypt, we had to live out of haste because we did not have the merit. And the point of remembering, of telling the story each year of the Exodus story, is trying to direct ourselves to understand what is the point of being that people which has God's message. As we said in last week's Haftarah, Amzu yatzarti li tilati yesaperu. I have formed this people in order to for them to tell my glory. What does it mean to be that people? What does it mean, Shimcha Hagadol Vakadosh Aleinu Karata? What does it mean that your name you have bestowed upon us? Atemi Dainu Hashem, the prophet says, you are my witnesses, you bear my testimony, says God. The Jewish people bear God's testimony. The more that we try to embrace this direction, the more we try to understand this and feel comfortable with this, the more we will be able to feel comfortable in our skin as the Jewish people, and the more the nations of the world will be comfortable with us, because they'll start understanding things about us which they had a hunch about the whole time, and we were always denying. Meaning that there is something special about the Jewish people. No, we're not the financial giants of the universe. No, we're not the best in business, even though there's some people who think they are. But there's something we have to teach the world about the spiritual life, about being human. And these are the things that the world wants to hear from us. They don't want Jews to keep denying, no, there's nothing special about Judaism. They want to hear what's special and how it's going to help them. And we have to say, yes, there's something special. There's something very spiritual about Judaism. There's something very humane about Judaism. And yes, it can help you in your lives, whether you are Jewish or not. If you're not Jewish, it can inspire you. And if you're Jewish, it's a whole system of how. So we should not deny that as people. And the more we understand it ourselves and feel comfortable, the more we would develop as individuals and as a people. And that's why he says the final redemption doesn't have to be in haste, because all the four galuyot, all the four exiles, are to bring us to that point. Whatever those exiles did, they brought us to that point. And therefore, it actually says in many places in the Zohar, like in Tikkunei Zohar, the Jewish people actually, in the end, it's not about the merit at the end, it's about the accumulative merit that the Jews go through. You know, one time, my father of blessed memory, he used to say, when he would see Jews who, secular Jews, assimilated Jews, Jews who he said, look, this is what the Shoah did to us. This is what the Holocaust did to us. And how can you judge people? We went through a trauma. We went through a national trauma. Every individual went through a trauma. There's no Jewish family in the world who doesn't have some relative who was affected by that directly or indirectly. So you can't really judge the Jewish people. And if we can understand that, believe me, God can understand that too. So we go through these arba galuyot, these four diasporas, and they bring us to a certain experience and understanding, and they purify us as a people. And this we have to do as individuals on Passover too. And then he says, and these are the four banim, these are the four sons. Each son represents a question. And these questions are individual and national questions that the Jews try to understand about the meaning of being a Jew. Let's just think for a second. What are the four questions of the sons? I'm just speculating to you, and if you want to write something, I'm always happy to hear feedback. So the first son, the wise sons, Ma'idot v'chukim v'mishpatim asher tziva Hashem Elokeinu etchem. What are all these precepts that God is teaching us? Then the second son says, Man ha'avodah hazot lechem. What is this burden? And the third son says, Mazot. And the fourth one says, nothing. Now the first one wants to understand the mitzvot. How does it help our lives? The second one says, because if it doesn't help our lives, it seems like a burden. And the third one says, Mazot. I need to understand the general picture, not just the individual precepts. And then the last one is just looking in awe, trying to figure out what it's all about. In a sense, you could flip the coin around. The one who doesn't know how to ask, who's looking in awe, in a sense, is the highest level. Because when you see something and you realize this is really different, which we're trying to do on the Passover night, right? We try to do all these things to make children ask, things that are different, hide the matzah. If you realize there's something different about Jewish life and it inspires you, there's something intuitive about that. That means you're starting to pick up something of what exactly Jewish life is supposed to do. It's like a package. And the package is supposed to point us in the direction of holiness, Kedoshim to you. So this was the first piece I wanted to read to you. So what is the order? The order of things is, and why it's called a Seder, because we have to now create order out of the haste that came from Egypt. And every year we're putting things in order to understand it. You know, a little bit your mind is the same thing. During the day, your brain receives a lot of impulses of information. And when you sleep, your brain is trying to make sense out of everything that happened during the day and catalog it, put it on the right shelf, and try to figure out what it was all about. So what happened in Egypt was a major he'ara with an aleph, a major illumination, where God grabbed us, pulled us out of Egypt, goy mikerav goy, a nation from another nation, like a birth. And in the preceding years, we have to figure out what exactly happened. In a small way, Isaac Luria, the Ari in Shara Kavanot, says something a little bit similar, but in a much smaller scale. He says that first night of Pesach, when God took us out when we had no merit, which is called Leil Shimurim, the night where we are guarded, is a night where, even without merit, the whole Jewish people have a direct connection with God. Nothing can touch us. Even the angel of death passes over our house and goes elsewhere. Nothing can touch us on that night. It's like a special, spiritual, massive influx of spiritual energy on that night. But then, the Ari says, from the next day, when that massive influx disappears, and we go back to being regular people again, you feel like I fell from the Igra Rama Labira Mikta. I just fell from a high roof to a low pit. I'm just an ordinary individual. What's going on? But the point there, he says, is to count the days of the Omer, one by one, up to 49, so that when you come to Shavuot, when you come to the day of the receiving of the Torah, you have your own merit in order to receive the Torah. Because to receive the Torah, it's not enough to have this influx from God. You need your own merit. You need to be able to help yourself, too, in order to get to that point. So the Ari has a similar concept. Sfat Emet is creating a long-range historical process out of this. But according to the Ari, you can actually see this from the night of Pesach, which is called Leil Shumurim, to Shavuot. And by the way, we'll see also how it relates to another idea of his, because the Ari said, well, I don't want to mix up the two, but basically for the Ari, you have this idea of not merit, a major influx where God has to take us out and has this interaction with the Jewish people. And then we have to build ourselves up slowly through the Sfirat HaOmer until we come to that level of Shavuot. Okay, so that is the order of things. That's the Seder. We're putting things into order in our minds and as human beings and trying to justify the fact every year that God took us out of, as a nation from Egypt. You know, it reminds me the famous speech of Ben Gurion in the United Nations after the birth of the State of Israel. Maybe many of you have heard it, where Ben Gurion said, "We are a very old nation, and we were thrown out into diasporas, but it doesn't mean that we're not connected to our nationhood." He says, look, if you ask the average American, who are the founding fathers of the United States, they would talk about the Pilgrims, who came on their ships to the United States, but they wouldn't know when exactly, they wouldn't know exactly what they wore, what the date was, or what they ate. He says, we know exactly. We know that we went as a people, we went forth from Egypt. It was the 15th day of Nisan. We left at 12 o'clock at night. And it says, Motnechem chagurim. We were wearing our belts and girdles. Na'alechem mi'reglechem. And we had our shoes on. Makelchem mi'adchem. We had our sticks. We even know what we ate was the matzah when we went forth. We remember that moment because a nation remembers the moment of its birth. So on Pesach night, when we are remembering the moment of our birth as a nation, there is a point to it. It's when you leave Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. We know exactly that we have a direction. We're not a nation just for the sake of being a nation, because empty nationalism is a form of racism, as Rabbi Cook actually writes in his Orot. But Jewish nationalism is altruistic, because the more that we believe that as a nation we have a message, a spiritual message, and an ethical message, the more we will try to be a light to nations and help ourselves and the world at large. We have just a few more minutes. I'll try to start one more piece here, which I think is also interesting. Or, you know what, instead of that, because I'm not sure if we'll finish the whole thing in 15 minutes, I'll read a smaller passage. Hadalat Sheilot, Raman Nishtana, because it's linked to what I just said before. This is on page Lamed Chadamed Beit 76, also on Pesach. It says the four questions that we say in the Manishtana, I mean the children say, but actually according to the Talmud in Sachim, if there are no children, then the adults say. If the adults don't know, then somebody has to say it. Even if you're one person, you have to ask yourself. Even if you are a scholar, it says, and you know all the answers, you got to ask, because responses mean more when you understand the question. Hadalut Sheilot, the four questions. Shemanishtan, and the Manishtan is the Duro Dalet Banim. They actually parallel the four sons. Ki matzah hu edut, because the matzah represents the precepts. Right? He says, what are the precepts and the laws that God has taught you? Mitzvot, it represents the precepts and the mitzvot. Also, the word mitzvot and matzot is actually spelled the same way. Shetziva lanu Hashem, that God taught us, commanded us. And the maror represents the question of the rebellious son, who doesn't really want all this bitterness because he considers it a burden. And therefore, the answer to the rebellious son is you have to hakot etshinav, which means to blunt his teeth. Because the maror represents the fact that we were enslaved in Egypt. And remember, this was all for you because you had no merit. And it definitely wasn't because of your lack of merit that we left Egypt. The Haseva, and the reason why the Tam, the simple son, says, Mazot, what is this? Because he realizes that we are reclining. So the question, okay, so again, the four questions are, the first one is, the first question is about the matzah. That's represented by the wise son, because the wise son talks about the mitzvot, and also matzah is one of the important mitzvot of this holiday. The Rasha, the rebellious son, which is talking about the burden, is the second question of the four questions where we're asking about the maror, because the bitterness is the enslavement. And we have to say to that son, unfortunately, because you had no merit, don't have merit because you're not interested in these things, we wouldn't have been able to go out of Egypt, but because God took us out. But your lack of merit didn't help. The third one, where we're talking about reclining, we need for the simple son, because the simple son notices changes. And when you recline, there's a change, because if you don't normally do it. And when he sees that change, he says, what is this? And the last question, which talks about dipping twice, meaning we dip the maror, and then we dip in the charoset, and we dip the karpas. It's in order that the one who doesn't ask questions should ask. Because sometimes it's not enough just a change. In order to induce questions, you have to do it again and again. That's called twice. In other words, the one who doesn't ask, you have to go back and find out again and try to help them again and again and again. Because those of the Jewish people who don't know how to ask the questions because of whatever reason, they went through communism, they went through assimilation, they went through a bad upbringing where Judaism was forced down their throats, which happens too. Whatever it is, you cannot turn your backs to them. You have to try again and again and again. And that's called the shtei pa'amim, the dipping again and again. Because remember, there are always 5 sons, and the 5th son is the one who didn't show up at the Seder. So as long as these people are connected, we have to reach out to them and realize that they are part of Am Yisrael as well. So these were 2 ideas that I wanted to bring to you tonight, this evening, about the Sfat Emet, And in each one, of course, he's trying to look for something which is more, that the ritual itself, the ceremonies itself that we do are metaphors for things that they are trying to teach us. We didn't just leave Egypt 3,000 years ago. And if we did, and we left in haste, it's because the show's not over. There is an act that we have to play. There is a scene that we are playing within this play, within this show. And every year we reenact it at the Passover Seder. And this is in order to understand what happened at point one in order to know which way we are going. And the more we understand our direction, the more we understand and we feel comfortable with ourselves as Jews, the more our message for ourselves, for our family, and for the world will be clarified. These are going through the galuyot, through the exiles. Every exile is to clarify something within the national consciousness of the Jewish people. And the four sons themselves, by the way, represent different sfeikot, different types of people within the Jewish people. You have the wise son, you have people who embrace the mitzvot, even though sometimes they don't always have all the answers. Some of the rabbis pretend to, but they don't always have all the answers. And then you have the rebellious son. The rebellious son, remember, knows a lot, but they're suspicious, wondering about these things. They don't seem so rational. Explain them to me. Do they have some inner logic to them, or are they just unrational? And the wise son is the one who's asking questions. Excuse me, the rebellious son, because the rebellious son really wants to know. I can tell you from my own experience, many people who I've come across, especially students over the years, who have asked some very difficult questions, and sometimes, just to make the point across, very often these people are really looking for something. And that's why they're asking the questions the way they are, because they really care. As Rabbi Shlomo Aviner says, then worse than non-belief is apathy, when you really don't care. That's much worse. Heresy is not apathy. Apathy is where you couldn't care anymore. And so then the simple son, of course, the one who's asking questions but is starting to lose this encounter, this interface with Judaism, we have to help build them up. And the Sheinoli Odeli Shol, we have to reach out, because we cannot stand in our halls of marble and expect them to show up. So we need to do things like Rabbi Constantine's Torah Daily Talks to outreach to people, for them to realize that there are deeper signs and dimensions to Judaism and deeper well springs that we can understand from. I like to wish everybody health and continued ability to sustain these lockdowns, and join me tomorrow at 1 o'clock also on this daily Torah Talks, where I continue my 20-minute talk on rabbinic responses to crisis and adversity. Tomorrow I will be talking about Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, a story from Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, and a small caption from the Sfat Emet. Toda Rabba, Erev Tov. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.